When most people think of castles and fortified structures, their minds immediately go to medieval Europe. The stone towers of England, the chateaux of France, or the imposing fortresses of Germany. Unbeknownst to most people of African descent, these magnificent structures actually have their roots deep in the African continent. The very concept of the fortified castle was born not in the misty hills of Scotland or the valleys of the Rhine, but in the ancient kingdoms of Africa. Our journey begins over 6,000 years ago in the land of the pharaohs, long before the first European castle was even conceived. The brilliant minds of ancient Africa were already revolutionizing the art of defensive architecture. It was pharaonic Egypt that built the world's first fortifications. The oldest of these remarkable structures dates back to the pre-dynastic period, approximately 6,000 years ago. To put this in perspective, this was thousands of years before the Great Pyramids were built, and millennia before the first European fortification would appear. The earliest evidence of these groundbreaking fortifications can be found at Mecca, the ancient capital of southern Kemet. Mecca was not just any city. It was the birthplace of one of history's most significant figures, Pharaoh Nama, who founded and unified Kemet approximately 5,300 years ago. When Nama conquered northern Kemet and united it with the south, he demonstrated the strategic importance of fortifications by establishing the northern capital of Menafori, which we now know today as Memphis. But this wasn't just any capital. It was a militarized city equipped with sophisticated fortifications designed to defend against enemies and secure the newly unified kingdom. This moment in history represents more than just the unification of Kemet. It represents the birth of strategic military architecture. The fortifications at Menafori were not crude walls or simple barriers. They were sophisticated defense systems that incorporated advanced engineering principles that would later influence fortress design across the ancient world. While Kemet built many fortified enclosures throughout its long history, there's one that stands above all others as the most emblematic and impressive: the great fortress of Buhen in Sudan. This massive structure represents the pinnacle of ancient African military architecture and serves as the prototype for all the castle features we associate with medieval Europe. The development of Buhen began approximately 5,000 years ago, but it reached its full glory under one of Kemet's most formidable warrior pharaohs, Senuseret, known to the Greeks as Sesostris III. This legendary ruler was not content with just ruling Kemet. His armies conquered Western Asia, including parts of Arabia, pushed into Europe as far as the Black Sea, and extended Kemetic power deep into Sudan. Although the people of Kemet knew they were of Sudanese origin, the relationships between these brother peoples were often tense and marked by conflict. To secure his frontiers and protect Kemet from other African enemies, Senuseret ordered the construction of numerous fortresses, with Buhen being the most impressive of all. The fortress of Buhen was absolutely extraordinary, covering a surface area of 13,000 square meters and stretching 150 meters in length. It was a marvel of ancient engineering. But what makes Buhen truly remarkable is that it contained every single element that we would later see in European castles some 3,000 years later. These included moats, arrow slits, ramparts, fortified gates, and drawbridges. Think about this for a moment. Every feature that we associate with the great castles of medieval Europe, every innovation that we credit to European military genius, had already been invented and perfected by black Africans of ancient Egypt and the Sudan. The fortress of Buhen was used continuously for nearly 1,300 years, a testament to its superior design and construction. Tragically, this magnificent monument to African engineering genius was lost forever in 1970 when it was submerged beneath the waters of the Nile Dam. But before its destruction, archaeologists were able to document its incredible features and create detailed reconstructions that show us just how advanced African military architecture had become thousands of years before similar structures appeared in Europe. The influence of African fortress technology didn't remain confined to the Nile Valley. As African civilizations expanded and interacted with other cultures, their architectural innovations spread across the continent and beyond. The Phoenicians, who were the first black people of the so-called Near East, extensively adopted and adapted African fortification techniques. Their great cities, including the legendary Carthage in present-day Tunisia, were protected by massive stone ramparts that reflected the influence of Egyptian and Sudanese military architecture. In what is now Ethiopia, the ancient kingdom of Aksum developed its own tradition of fortress building. Before the arrival of Christianity in the 4th century, Aksum was a civilization of the pharaonic type. Along with its famous giant obelisks, Aksum built impressive castles and fortifications approximately 2,000 years ago. This is particularly significant because it shows that African fortress technology was developing simultaneously with or even before similar developments in China. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe also contributed to this rich tradition of African military architecture. The fort at Manwa, built on a hill in the 5th century, represents the oldest structure of Zimbabwean civilization. But perhaps even more impressive is the fortified city of Jado in Niger, a remarkable site that has been largely forgotten and unknown to most Africans today. According to UNESCO data, the fortified city of Jado was built between 1,500 and 2,500 years ago. Its ruins reveal an elaborate ancient city that demonstrates the sophistication of African urban planning and defensive architecture. This site, located near an oasis in the borders of North Africa, was most likely built by the Berber Garamantes, showing how African fortress technology spread across different ethnic and cultural groups. The most dramatic chapter in the story of African fortress technology's global influence begins in the 8th century CE, when the Black Berbers of the Maghreb, known as Moors or Saracens, launched their conquest of Europe. In 640 CE, when the Western Roman Empire had already collapsed, Arab armies entered Africa through Egypt. Within a few decades, they had conquered the Black Maghreb by force. In the momentum of this Muslim imperialism, the Black Berbers of the Maghreb invaded Spain in 711 CE, along with Portugal, Sicily, and southern France. This invasion was more than just a military conquest. It was a technological and cultural revolution. Europe at this time had fallen into a semi-barbarous state, and it was the blacks and Arabs who would initiate its renaissance. The Moors brought with them all the accumulated experience of African fortress construction that had been developing for thousands of years. The first European fortress built using African technology was constructed by the Africans themselves at Gibraltar in 711 CE. From there, the Moors covered their new territories with sophisticated defensive structures that were far more advanced than anything Europe had seen before. It was only 2 centuries later that France, responding to these invasions and to the Scandinavian attacks, began to build its own fortifications. By the 12th century, Europeans were multiplying these structures and giving them the importance they would have in medieval history. But we must be clear about what was happening here. Europeans were not inventing castle technology. They were learning it from Africans who had conquered their lands. The sophisticated defensive features, the architectural innovations, the strategic placement, all of this came from thousands of years of African experience in fortress building. Even as African fortress technology was transforming Europe, the tradition continued to flourish on the African continent itself. The Black Moroccan kings continued to build fortifications in Africa, maintaining and developing the architectural traditions that had begun thousands of years earlier. When Europeans arrived in Africa in the 15th century to begin what they euphemistically called exploration, but what was actually the beginning of the terrorist enterprise of slavery, they found that fortified castles were still very much in use across the continent. For example, French historian Nicolas Sanson de Abbeville, writing in the 17th century, based on eyewitness accounts, described the palace at Kami in Zimbabwe as large, magnificent, flanked by towers on the outside with 4 main gates. The Dutch explorer Ulfert Dapper added that one enters through 4 large portals where the emperor's guards take turns standing sentinel. The exterior is fortified with towers. These descriptions reveal that African fortress architecture was not some ancient relic, but a living, evolving tradition that continued to develop and adapt over thousands of years. Even into the 18th century, Ethiopians were still building fortified castles, such as the impressive structure at Gondar in the north of the country, the Tata or forts of Sikasso in Mali, and the Hausa forts in Nigeria would be among the last active fortifications in Africa, disappearing only after the colonial invasions that brought an end to an architectural tradition that had lasted 6,000 years. The story of the African origins of fortified castles is more than just an interesting historical footnote. It represents a fundamental challenge to the way we understand the development of human civilization and the contributions of different cultures to our shared heritage. For too long, the narrative of technological and architectural innovation has been dominated by European perspectives that ignore or minimize the foundational contributions of African civilizations. The evidence we've explored today shows clearly that the fortified castle, one of the most iconic and influential architectural forms in human history, was born in Africa and perfected by African minds thousands of years before similar structures appeared in Europe. This is not about diminishing the achievements of other civilizations, but about giving credit where credit is due. It's about recognizing that the magnificent castles of medieval Europe, the structures that have captured imaginations for centuries, are actually the descendants of African innovations that began in the ancient kingdoms of the Nile Valley. Proud of your ancestry, remain black and proud.